The wind, a ceaseless dry rasp, was the only constant in Presidio, Texas, 1889. It whipped across the Chihuahuan desert, kicking up ochre dust that coated everything, the faded plank walls of the few scattered buildings, the brittle scrub brush, and the weary faces of those who dared to call this arid corner of the United States home. It was a sound that spoke of endless, suffocating isolation. Eleanor Holloway wiped a film of sweat and dust from her forehead, her gaze fixed on the house. It wasn't the dilapidated shack she had expected. Instead, it was a relatively stout structure of dark, sun-scorched timber, 2 stories high, set back from the main, dusty trail. The windows, though grimy, were intact, and a sense of unnatural silence clung to the place, a silence that defied the incessant wind. "Well, Elle," a voice drawled from behind her. Her younger sister, Lillian, leaned against the buckboard, her face pale beneath the travel grime. "It's certainly a house. I thought Papa said it was abandoned." Eleanor squinted. "It was. Has been for 5 years, according to Mr. O'Malley at the land office. Said the last family, the Cranes, just packed up and left one night, didn't even sell the livestock. They had traveled 3 weeks from San Antonio. Their father, a shrewd but aging man seeking to recoup a series of poor investments, had bought the property site unseen, intending to flip it after minor repairs. He had tasked his 2 daughters with the minor repairs and the setup of a temporary boarding house to generate immediate income. Eleanor, 27, was pragmatic and reserved, a woman accustomed to managing her father's scattered affairs. Lillian, 22, was more spirited, though the relentless journey had clearly sapped her resolve. They unloaded the last of their meager belongings, a trunk of clothing, a crate of preserved food, and a heavy wooden box containing their most valuable possessions, a clock, a Bible, and a tin box of Eleanor's ledgers. The front door groaned open like a reluctant beast when Eleanor pushed it. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and cold, despite the Texas heat. It smelled of dry rot, old ash, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that Eleanor couldn't place. "The smell," Lillian whispered, wrinkling her nose. "What is that?" "Dampness, probably. Old houses have smells," Eleanor said, more to reassure herself than Lillian. She lit a lantern, its sickly yellow glow cutting through the gloom. The ground floor consisted of a main room, a parlor, that led into a small kitchen and a pantry. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. The furniture was minimal and robust, a scarred wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, and a heavy, unadorned fireplace dominating one wall. As Eleanor moved toward the kitchen, her boot heel struck something on the floor. She paused, holding the lantern lower. The floorboards here were unusually sturdy, almost new-looking in sections, dark with age and wear, but oddly mismatched. One particular section, running the width of the parlor and kitchen, felt strangely solid, as if the joists beneath were closer together than normal. Lillian, meanwhile, was exploring the pantry. "Elle, look at this!" Eleanor joined her. The pantry was small, but the shelves were lined with dozens of jars. They were empty now, but the labels, faded and brittle, suggested a meticulous organization of canned goods, from pickled onions to plum preserves. Yet, standing on the floor, Eleanor felt that unsettling solidness again. She knelt, running her fingers over the planks. They were tightly joined, but one area, about 6 feet by 3, seemed to have been recently worked on. There were faint, almost imperceptible tool marks near the edges. "Someone nailed this down hard," Eleanor muttered, rising. "Very hard." "Why bother? It's just the floor," Lillian said, shivering despite the heat. "Maybe they were repairing a leak, or a weak joist." Eleanor tried to sound logical, but the silence inside the house was beginning to feel oppressive, a weight pressing down on her ears. It made her own breathing sound loud, almost frantic. That night, they slept on mattresses spread in the upstairs bedroom, the only room that felt somewhat free of the heavy, oppressive odor. But sleep did not come easily. The wind howled, rattling the single window pane, mimicking the sound of distant, mournful cries. Around midnight, Eleanor was jolted awake by a thump from the floor below. She sat bolt upright, lantern light bathing the room in a shaky glow. Lillian was already awake, clutching her blanket to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" Lillian whispered, her voice tight. "A mouse," Eleanor said, forcing calm into her voice. "Or the house settling." Another sound followed, not a thump this time, but a faint rhythmic scratching sound, like nails dragged across timber. It came directly from the floor below, from the parlor, specifically from the section of the floor that Eleanor had noticed. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. It was the sound of something trying to get out, or perhaps trying to get in. Eleanor slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy iron poker they had brought for self-defense. "Stay here, Lil," she commanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, carefully, she descended the creaking stairs. The temperature on the lower floor was noticeably colder. The metallic, sweet smell was stronger now, a cloying stench that made her stomach turn. She held the lantern high, its light catching the dust motes dancing in the cold, still air. She stood in the center of the parlor, poker held ready. The scratching had stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that pressed in, amplifying the pulse in her ears. She moved the lantern closer to the floor, right over the area of the suspicious planks. Nothing. Just old wood. Then she saw it. Near the edge of the patched section, where the plank met the wall, a tiny, almost invisible sliver of freshly disturbed earth, not dust, but dark, loamy soil, had been pushed up through the seam. Eleanor's breath hitched. She hadn't seen a patch of dirt like that since they dug the outhouse pit a week ago. This house was built on a stone foundation, solid and dry. She dropped to her knees, setting the lantern down. The light revealed another detail, a faint, dark stain running along the seam of the newly worked planks. It was the color of old, dried blood. As she reached out a trembling finger to touch the stain, a chilling sensation crawled up her spine. Not a noise this time, but a distinct pressure on the wood, directly beneath her hand. It felt like a small, deliberate upward push, as if something from below was testing the planks. Eleanor sprang back, the poker clattering to the floor, her heart racing with pure, unadulterated terror. She scrambled backward, colliding with the foot of the stairs, her eyes locked on the floor. The pushing stopped. The silence returned, more profound and menacing than before. She grabbed the poker again, her knuckles white. She looked up at the stairs, then back at the floorboards. The stain, the dirt, the subtle push. It wasn't a draft, or a mouse, or the house settling. It was deliberate. Someone had been down there, or something was down there, and those planks were the only thing keeping it buried. She had to get out, but Lillian was upstairs. She had to think. What kind of person or deed would require such a strong, secret burial beneath the very foundation of a home? Eleanor's mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but the image of the pushed-up dirt and the small dark stain overruled all logic. There was a secret here, a terrifying one, and it lay right beneath their feet. This is only the beginning of the Holloway sisters' nightmare. The key to their survival is buried deep in the past of this desolate corner of Texas. If you're gripped by this mystery, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The truth behind the floor is far more disturbing than you can imagine. Eleanor retreated silently up the stairs, the heavy iron poker clasped so tightly her hands ached. She found Lillian huddled under the covers, shaking uncontrollably. "What did you see, Elle? Was it a rat? Did you hear it?" Lillian's voice was strained, high-pitched. "It stopped," Eleanor lied, her voice shaky despite her attempt at control. "Just the wind playing tricks, Lil. And maybe a large field rat in the walls." Lillian didn't look convinced, but the exhaustion of the long journey finally claimed her. Eleanor, however, remained awake, sitting against the bedroom door, the lantern burning low. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards above the parlor. She didn't dare sleep. The image of the dark stain and the subtle push from below was too vivid, too terrifyingly real. As the first faint streaks of dawn appeared outside the window, the silence of the house broke again. This time it wasn't a scratch or a push. It was the sound of digging. A dull, muffled thud, thud, thud sound, rhythmic and heavy, coming from directly beneath the floor of the parlor. It was deep, suggesting earth being struck, but the sound traveled through the solid timber with terrifying clarity. It was slow, deliberate, and undeniably human in its rhythm, though far too muted to be happening in the room itself. Eleanor slowly crept down the stairs, the air growing colder with every step. The metallic, sweet stench was overwhelming now, making her gag. She stopped at the bottom, poker ready. The sound of digging was clearer here, a relentless, sickening tempo. Thud. Pause. Thud, thud. Scrape. She knew what she had to do. They couldn't live in a house built over a hidden grave, especially one that seemed to be active. Lillian came down a moment later, rubbing sleep from her eyes, but froze halfway down the stairs. "What is that noise?" she whispered, her face draining of color. "It's coming from below the floor, Lil," Eleanor stated, her voice flat, emotionless. She crossed to the mantelpiece and returned with a heavy, rusty fire iron. "We're going to open that section." Lillian was appalled. "Are you mad, Elle? What if it's someone trapped, or something else?" "If it's someone trapped, they're not asking for help, they're digging," Eleanor said grimly. "And if it's something else, we need to know what we're facing before it claws its way through the timber." They spent the next hour examining the patch of floor. The planks were secured with long, square-headed nails. To remove them quietly was impossible. Eleanor finally forced Lillian to go outside and fetch the heaviest tool they owned, a small but sturdy wrecking bar. When Lillian returned, shaking, Eleanor set the lantern right beside the seam and wedged the flat edge of the bar into the narrow gap where the planks met the main floor. "Ready?" Eleanor asked, her eyes fixed on the gap. Lillian simply nodded, her hand clamped over her mouth. Eleanor applied pressure. The wood groaned, protesting years of being held fast. With a sickening crack, the head of one nail snapped and a tiny section of the plank lifted. The moment the gap widened, the smell rushed out. A terrible concentrated burst of putrefaction and damp earth that made both sisters recoil violently, coughing and choking. It was beyond dampness. It was the unmistakable, horrifying stench of decay. More critically, the digging stopped instantly. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the parlor. The wind outside seemed to die down, leaving the house suspended in a vacuum of terror. "It heard us," Lillian whimpered, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. "It knew we were listening." Eleanor, recovering her composure, didn't answer. She could now peer into the gap. It was pitch black beneath, the beam of the lantern barely penetrating the deep cavity. The opening wasn't large enough to reveal anything concrete, but what she saw, or rather what she didn't see, was profoundly disturbing. "There's no foundation under here, Lil," Eleanor murmured, her voice hollow. "No stone or brick. It's just bare earth, dug out to create a cavity." She inserted the wrecking bar deeper and pried again. Another nail shrieked and bent. As the plank lifted further, Eleanor leaned closer, ignoring the vile odor. She held the lantern high, trying to pierce the gloom. Then, the light caught something. Not bone, not cloth, but a piece of timber, about the size of a man's hand, lying near the inner edge of the cavity. It was clearly a part of a small, broken wooden toy. A child's block, perhaps. And beside the block, nestled in the damp earth, was a tiny, smooth, white object. Lillian had followed her sister's gaze. As Eleanor reached out to brush away the dirt, Lillian gasped. a sound of pure terror. "El, don't touch it. Please don't." Eleanor ignored her. She gently lifted the object. It was thin, curved, and undeniably a small human rib bone. They weren't just standing over a grave. They were standing over a mass burial site, and something down there was still moving, still digging, still hiding. Eleanor let the bone drop back into the hole, her mind reeling. "We're leaving," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We need to get to Presidio, report this, and get help. We're not staying here another night." As the sisters turned to gather their things, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the opposite end of the parlor. They froze. It was the floor, but not the patch they had opened. It was a heavy, dull sound, as if a weight had been dropped onto the outside edge of the freshly repaired planks. A weight that had just shifted, deep below the surface. The silence returned, but this time it was broken by a horrifying sound. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to travel through the earth itself, vibrating the very soles of their boots. The language was unintelligible, but the malice was unmistakable. They were trapped. The whisper was a phantom, dissipating into the oppressive morning air, but the terror it left behind was concrete. Eleanor and Lillian stumbled over their own feet, scrambling to replace the floor plank, hammering the bent nails back in place with the side of the wrecking bar. It was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to seal the horrors they had glimpsed. "Presidio. Now," Eleanor urged, snatching up her worn leather satchel. They harnessed the horse to the buckboard in a frenzy, their movements jerky and panicked. As they pulled away from the house, Eleanor paused, looking back at the stark, silent structure. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch them go. The journey to Presidio, which should have taken 2 hours at a brisk pace, felt endless. The sun was climbing, its heat merciless, baking the dusty trail. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who were the Cranes, the family who abandoned the house? What children were buried there? And what was that terrifying, persistent movement beneath the floor? When they finally reached the edge of the small, dusty town, Presidio was less a town and more a fortified trading post, a scattering of saloons, a general store, and the small, official-looking building of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Jedediah Thorne was a man carved from sun-dried leather and suspicion. He sat behind a scarred wooden desk, cleaning his rifle, the moment they burst in. "Sheriff, you must come quickly," Eleanor gasped, leaning against the doorframe trying to catch her breath. "At the old Crane property, there's been a murder, a mass grave." Thorne slowly lowered his rifle, his pale blue eyes sizing them up. "Holloway girls, ain't you? Came to turn that old place into a boarding house. Took you long enough to arrive." "We found bones, Sheriff, children's bones, and the floor was ripped up and sealed again. There's dirt and a horrible stench," Lillian blurted out, trembling. Thorne leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The Cranes, they left 5 years back. Just up and went." "Why?" Eleanor pressed. "Did anyone look into that?" "Folks out here come and go, ma'am," Thorne said dismissively. "It's the frontier. Ran off on a debt, maybe. Nothing suspicious about that. Nobody missed 'em. But the children, ma'am, the Cranes had 2 young kids when they left, a boy and a girl. They took 'em." Thorne tapped his fingers on the desk. "Now, if you found bones, it's likely old. Used to be a Kiowa camp near that spot. Could be anything." Eleanor felt a wave of crushing frustration. "Sheriff, this was under the house, beneath the parlor floor, and last night, something was digging." That detail finally caught Thorne's attention. He stopped tapping. "Digging?" Eleanor recounted the scratching, the smell, the push, and the final horrifying glimpse of the rib bone. Thorne listened in silence, his expression hardening, losing its dismissive indifference. "All right," he finally conceded, standing up. "I'll ride out with you, but you'll wait outside. I'm not bringing 2 women into a potential crime scene." As they prepared to leave, A tall, gaunt man with a tired face and calloused hands walked into the office. This was Mr. Silas Crane, the brother of the man who had owned the house 5 years prior. He was an infrequent, quiet visitor to Presidio. Thorne introduced them. "Silas, these ladies bought your brother's old place. They're telling me a strange story about the floor." Silas Crane's eyes, already shadowed, grew wide with immediate, profound fear. His face went chalk white. He looked directly at Eleanor, bypassing Thorne entirely. "The floor," Silas whispered, his voice catching in his throat. Did you open it?" "We only pried up a little corner," Eleanor admitted. "Why? What do you know about it, Mr. Crane?" Silas stumbled backward, hitting the wall. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room as if trying to find an escape. He looked less like a man asked about his past, and more like a man facing imminent execution. I don't know nothing," he stammered. "My brother Jacob, he just wanted to forget that place. Said the dust was bad. He took the wife and kids and left. Said he'd never look back. His denial was too frantic, too absolute." It didn't sound like a denial of knowledge, but a desperate effort to maintain a secret he was terrified to confront. "Did your brother say anything about the floorboards being replaced?" Eleanor pressed, sensing his fracture. Silas choked, covering his mouth. "He only told me to never ever step inside the house again." He looked at the floor of the sheriff's office as if the very ground could open up beneath him. He said, "There's things down there that don't belong to the living." Things he put there. With that chilling confession, Silas bolted, stumbling out of the office and disappearing down the dusty street before Thorne or the sisters could react. His panic confirmed their worst fears. The Cranes knew everything, and they were running from a monstrous crime. But the implication that Jacob put the things there only deepened the horror. Thorne looked from the empty doorway to the two shaken women. He picked up his rifle, his suspicion replaced by a grim determination. "Let's go, ladies. I think we just got our first confession." The ride back to the Holloway house was tense and silent. Sheriff Thorne, now grave, led the way. He stopped his horse 50 yards from the house and dismounted, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. "You two stay here. Don't go near the house no matter what you hear," he ordered Eleanor and Lillian. Eleanor watched him approach the house, his boots kicking up dust. He was methodical, checking the windows, testing the back door, before finally pushing open the front door with a decisive thud. The moment Thorne stepped inside, the oppressive silence of the house seemed to swallow him whole. Eleanor and Lillian waited. They heard nothing. No shout, no struggle, just the persistent dry wind. The silence stretched, becoming an agonizing vacuum. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "He should be back," Lillian whispered, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "He's been in there too long." "He's probably examining the floor, Lil," Eleanor tried to assure her, but a cold dread was tightening around her own chest. At the 15-minute mark, a new sound came from the house, a sudden, sharp, metallic clang. It sounded like the heavy iron poker Eleanor had used being thrown or dropped with great force. Immediately following the clang, there was a muffled shout, Thorne's voice, thick with exertion and surprise. Then, the sound of splintering wood, followed by a heavy, uneven, dragging sound, as if something bulky and very heavy was being pulled across the parlor floor. The sisters stared at the front door, paralyzed. The dragging stopped, replaced by a terrible, sickening crunch. "He's in trouble," Eleanor said, grabbing the reins. "I have to go in." "No, El, he told us to stay out," Lillian pleaded, grabbing her sister's arm. "If we wait, he's dead, and we're next. We need to know what he's fighting," Eleanor retorted, her fear overriding her caution. She handed Lillian the reins. "Stay with the horse. If I scream, you ride. Ride until you hit civilization." Armed with nothing but a desperate resolve, Eleanor slipped out of the buckboard and crept toward the house. She paused at the front door, listening, The silence was back, absolute and complete. Not even the wind dared to make a sound. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The parlor was a scene of baffling, horrifying confusion. Sheriff Thorne was on the floor, but he wasn't dead. He was pinned. His left arm twisted awkwardly beneath him, his face contorted in pain, but his eyes were open, staring at the floor. But the most immediate horror was the floor itself. The patched section Eleanor and Lillian had examined was gone. The heavy planks had been ripped away, not neatly removed, but violently shattered, pieces scattered across the room like shrapnel. In the center of the cavity, where the floor had been, the earth had been freshly disturbed, piled high on one side. A crude trench had been dug out, deep and wide, clearly revealing the rough dirt walls of the cavity. Thorne had a wild, disbelieving look in his eyes. He didn't look at Eleanor. He looked into the hole. "What happened, Sheriff?" Eleanor whispered, creeping closer. "What attacked you?" Thorne struggled to speak, his lips dry and cracked. "Nothing. Nothing attacked me. I opened the floor, tried to dig." He pointed with a trembling hand to a crude, rusted pickaxe lying nearby. "But when I broke through..." Eleanor followed his gaze into the dark, exposed earth. The hole was perhaps 3 feet deep. The stench of decay and damp earth was overwhelming, and now, mingling with it, was a new odor, ammonia and human waste. What she saw at the bottom of the trench wasn't a body. It was a crude, makeshift wooden box, barely visible, its surface rotting and stained. And on top of that box, nestled right in the damp earth, were not bones, but a collection of small, child-sized leather boots. At least 5 pairs, lined up neatly, as if placed there deliberately. "The Cranes didn't have 5 children, Sheriff," Eleanor whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "They did not," Thorne rasped, trying to sit up. "But I found this." He nodded toward his right hand, which was gripping something tightly. Eleanor knelt beside him. He opened his palm. Resting there was not a clue, but a warning. A small, intricately carved wooden doll's face. It was old, stained, and its carved smile was unnaturally wide, malicious and knowing. But the sheriff's confusion was rooted in something else. He pointed a shaking finger at the pile of freshly dug earth. "When I broke through the air down there, it was warm, like someone was just working. The digging hadn't stopped 5 years ago. It had continued right up until the moment Thorne broke through. I tried to grab a sample of the earth," Thorne continued, his voice heavy with shock. "But when I reached in, I felt movement." The dirt pile shifted, not from settling but from something moving under it. He suddenly choked, his eyes darting frantically. "It's not just the dead down there, Eleanor. It's the living, and whatever they're hiding." As he spoke, a soft, sickening squelch echoed from the darkness of the trench, followed by the faint, almost silent sound of something being dragged through the wet earth, deeper into the cavity. It was moving away from the light, retreating into the darkness beneath the house. Eleanor grabbed the sheriff's good arm, hauling him up. "We have to leave now, Sheriff. It's down there, and it knows we're here." They staggered out into the harsh sunlight, leaving the wreckage of the floor and the silent, retreating horror behind. The truth was worse than murder. It was a crime of sustained, prolonged atrocity, and the evidence was trying to escape. Back at the buckboard, Lillian stared at the bloody patch on Sheriff Thorne's left sleeve, but it was the terror in his eyes that truly shook her. Thorne was a hardened man of the frontier, yet he looked utterly broken. "We have to go back to Presidio," Thorne insisted, his voice weak. "I need to telegraph a request for federal marshals. This is beyond my jurisdiction." Eleanor, however, had a new, grim resolution. "The marshal won't be here for days, Sheriff. We have to know what the Cranes were doing before this thing down there escapes or is covered up again." The key, she realized, wasn't in the dirt, but in the Crane's paper trail. The house had been abandoned suddenly, but not completely. The pantry, Eleanor announced. It was meticulously stocked. People who leave suddenly don't empty their shelves unless they had a reason. Despite Thorne's protests, Eleanor insisted they examine the house one last time, promising to stay only in the kitchen-pantry area. Thorne, too injured to stop her, reluctantly agreed. Eleanor and Lillian re-entered the house, skirting the massive hole in the parlor floor. The smell was suffocating. In the pantry, the empty labeled jars stood as mute witnesses to the Crane's organized life. Eleanor started checking the undersides of shelves and the backs of drawers. "Look at this," Lillian whispered, pointing to the base of the chimney that ran through the pantry wall. Embedded into the stone was a single dark, rusted metal ring, like a handle. Eleanor scraped away the dried mortar around the ring with her knife. It was an old iron hook fixed to a small, nearly invisible wooden panel set into the stone. She tugged. The panel swung inward, revealing a small, dark recess, a crude cubbyhole. Inside was a single object wrapped in a brittle piece of oiled canvas, a ledger book. The book was thick, bound in cracked leather, and heavily water-stained. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a journal, written in a meticulous, cramped hand, the handwriting of Jacob Crane, the previous owner. Eleanor quickly flipped to the first entry, dated 7 years prior. October 4th, 1882. The work begins. The soil here is perfect, damp enough to hold, but dry enough not to rot too fast. The children, they are proving invaluable. Their small hands can reach what mine cannot. We must be quick. Soon the railroad will pass close by and the land will be worth a fortune. The secret must be buried deep. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Children, invaluable. She skipped ahead, scanning for clues. The entries were a horrific mix of cold pragmatism and escalating madness. Jacob Crane wasn't running a farm. He was running a nightmare. March 12th, 1884. The first shipment arrived, 3 small ones, healthy. They were not frightened, merely confused. I explained to the older one, the dark-haired boy, that this was a game. He cried for a time. The smaller ones are easier to manage, but their screams carry. July 1st, 1884. The hole is deep enough now. The moisture is a problem, but nothing a layer of cedar chips won't fix. The floorboards are heavy, need to secure them better. My wife, Martha, is beginning to weep too much. She doesn't understand the necessity of this. The soil must be turned to hide the smell. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. The boots, the smell, the digging. It wasn't just a crime. It was a sustained project, a system of sustained cruelty and murder over years. But why? She found an entry dated shortly before the Cranes abandoned the house. April 19th, 1884. The final tally is 12. 12 perfect layers. It should have been enough. I needed more. The earth. It keeps crying for more. I hear the scratching now, always. Not from the children anymore, but from the mother. The final entry was a scrawled, panicked mess, dated 5 years ago, the day they fled. May 5th, 1884. Gone. Gone. Martha took the kids and ran, but she can't outrun the earth's hunger. It's awake now. The scratching is too loud. The mother is coming up. I sealed it. I sealed it with all my might. But I hear them, and I hear her. The floor is no longer just a floor. It is a womb and a coffin. Eleanor closed the book, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "This is it, Lil," she said, her voice strained. Jacob Crane was burying children, maybe his own, maybe others he kidnapped. But he thought something else was down there with them, something he called the mother. They hurried back outside, the ledger clutched like a poisonous snake. Thorne read the entries, his face a mask of sickened disbelief. 12 children, he muttered. God help us. But the digging is still happening, Sheriff, Eleanor reminded him. The hole you opened, it was warm. Crane said the mother was coming up. Whatever it is, it's alive, it's strong, and it was working. Before Thorne could respond, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the chimney of the Holloway house. A loud whoosh sounded, and a column of acrid black smoke poured out, thick and oily. "The ledger!" Lillian screamed. He must have set a timer. Something that would ignite the book. "No," Eleanor corrected, pointing to the chimney. "The smoke is coming from the floor, running up through the flue." It wasn't a timer for the ledger, it was a signal. Jacob Crane had been meticulous about organizing his home and his crime. The smoke meant the interior of the house was now filled with a flammable vapor, or perhaps a warning. The digging had stopped, but the fire was starting. The secret of the Holloway house was about to be cleansed by flame. The black smoke billowing from the chimney quickly intensified, turning the air around the house thick and suffocating. Eleanor and Thorne knew this wasn't an accidental blaze. Jacob Crane, or someone helping him, had set a trap to destroy the evidence and perhaps to silence any witnesses who might uncover the depths of his depravity. "We have to get water, Sheriff," Eleanor yelled, coughing from the fumes. "The well!" Thorne, despite his injury, managed to help them. They spent a frantic 20 minutes hauling water from the deep, dry well, splashing it uselessly against the already blazing structure. The old sun-baked timber of the house caught fire quickly, roaring to life. "It's too late," Thorne finally admitted, falling back onto the dusty ground, exhausted and defeated. "It's too hot. We have to let it burn." Eleanor stared at the inferno. The flames were consuming the house, the physical manifestation of Crane's madness and their terror. But her mind was still on the ledger. 12 children. The mother. "The hole," she said, her voice strained. "The fire is burning the floorboards. The heat will dry out the earth and kill whatever is down there. Or dry it out and let it breathe," Thorne countered grimly. "That fire is going to bake that ground. If there's any air pocket, that heat will force anything living out." As the structure began to collapse, sending a shower of burning timber into the sky, a final, horrifying development occurred. The heavy, metallic object Eleanor had seen on the floor, the fireplace grate, was blown outward by a sudden, intense burst of heat and pressure from underneath the house. It landed 20 feet away with a terrible clang. Then, from the spot where the parlor floor had been, a great, hissing cloud of steam and dust erupted. The heat of the fire had superheated the damp earth in the deep cavity. But within the cloud of dust and steam, a shape began to emerge. Not a spectral shape, but a rough, dark humanoid form, covered in mud, soot, and burning fibers. It was Jacob Crane, the previous owner. He was staggering, half-burnt, his clothes shredded and filthy, his face a mask of ecstatic, deranged triumph. He had not fled 5 years ago. He had been living in the subterranean cavity beneath the house, the womb he spoke of, maintaining his terrible secret, tending to his ghastly project. He hadn't been digging up. He had been digging deeper. He didn't look at the fire, or the sisters, or the sheriff. His eyes were fixed on the sky, a terrible, wide smile cracking his scorched lips. "It's clean. It's clean," he roared, his voice hoarse and broken. "The mother will be proud. The seeds are safe." He stumbled towards them, his movements jerky and unnatural, not like a fugitive, but like a desperate creature emerging from a long hibernation. "You shouldn't have opened the floor," he shrieked, pointing a blackened finger at Eleanor. "You woke the hunger. She feeds now. She's hungry." Thorne reacted instantly, pulling his sidearm. "Crane, stop right there. You are under arrest for murder." Crane ignored him, stumbling past, heading not for the woods, but for the open desert, the land where he believed his mother resided. "The earth will protect us," he screamed, stumbling into the choking dust. Thorne fired 2 shots. The first missed, kicking up dust behind Crane. The second struck Crane in the leg. He let out a piercing shriek, but instead of falling, he clawed at the air, his remaining momentum carrying him forward. He fell into a dried creek bed about 30 yards from the house, disappearing behind a small ridge. Eleanor, adrenaline pumping, didn't hesitate. "He can't get away. He knows where the rest of the evidence is, and he's the only one who can explain the ledger." She and Lillian scrambled after Thorne, who was already running, hobbled by his own injury. When they reached the ridge, they looked down into the creek bed. Jacob Crane was gone. The only evidence of his passing was a smear of fresh, dark blood on the cracked, dry clay. "He's running," Thorne gasped, reloading his weapon. "He knows this territory better than any man alive." Lillian pointed. "Sheriff, look." He dropped something. Nestled near the smear of blood was a single small brown leather pouch. Eleanor picked it up. It was heavy. Inside, wrapped in a thick piece of cloth, was a stack of banknotes, old American currency, but a considerable sum for a desperate man on the run. But the final item was more telling. A thin iron key, intricately carved, unlike any house key Eleanor had ever seen. It was the key, perhaps, to the last part of Jacob Crane's secret. The sun beat down on the three of them, exhausted and shell-shocked. The Holloway house was now an open, raging pyre, its secret laid bare in the form of the madman who had just emerged from its subterranean tomb. They had the confession, the horrific ledger, and the key. Now they had the killer on the run. Sheriff Thorne, Eleanor, and Lillian made it back to Presidio by late afternoon. Thorne immediately telegraphed Fort Stockton for the federal marshal, detailing the mass grave, the ledger's contents, and the escape of Jacob Crane. The rest of the evening was spent examining the evidence. The leather pouch and the money were a baffling clue. Why would Crane, a supposed madman, carry a significant sum of cash? And why would he drop it, along with the cryptic iron key, unless he was in an absolute panic? "He was trying to make his escape," Thorne suggested, nursing his injured arm. "He must have had that key for a safe deposit box or a second stash of money somewhere." "No, Sheriff," Eleanor countered, looking at the key. "It was far too ornate for a bank. This key looks like it was made by a locksmith specifically for a very heavy lock. A trunk or maybe a cellar door. The key to the rest of the secrets. They spent hours trying to find a link to the money. Finally, they cross-referenced the names in Crane's final transactions with the general store ledger. A series of cash purchases for specialized items, quicklime, heavy timber, industrial canvas, and children's boots. He was covering his tracks, buying things needed for sustained burial and construction, Eleanor realized. "And he was paying for it with this," Thorne said, pointing to the money. "Where did he get the money?" "The ledger said the children were invaluable," Lillian whispered, her voice still raw from the trauma. "He wasn't burying his own kids, Sheriff. He was running a business." The terrifying realization struck them. Jacob Crane was a trafficker. He brought children, murdered them, and buried them beneath the house. But the money didn't come from a sale. It came from payments for the goods, the quicklime, the timber, the clothes. Crane was simply using his profits to sustain his hideous operation. The question remained, who was he working for? The next morning, the federal marshal was still days away. Thorne, recognizing that the trail would run cold, made a difficult decision. "I need to talk to Silas Crane again," Thorne announced. "He's the brother. He knows where Jacob hid his savings, or where he went." They found Silas Crane in his dusty small cabin on the outskirts of Presidio. He was a broken man, cowering in a corner, rocking back and forth. I told you nothing," he cried out when they entered. "Silas, Jacob is alive," Thorne said flatly. "He set the house on fire and he's on the run. We have his ledger. It details the murder of 12 children. You are now an accessory after the fact." "You can help yourself by telling us everything." Silas stared at the dirt floor, sobbing. "He didn't tell me nothing. He only came by when he needed things." "What things, Silas?" Eleanor pressed, holding up the ledger. "Quicklime? Canvas? Did he talk about the mother or the earth's hunger?" Silas visibly flinched at the word mother. He said the earth was greedy, said the house had a bad feeling. He just asked me to deliver packages. What packages? Heavy crates. Always at night. Delivered to the house. He paid me good money. Who gave you the crates? Silas finally broke, his voice a choked whisper. They came on the train. The midnight freight train that runs through the valley twice a week. They came from El Paso. El Paso, a major trading hub. Jacob Crane was not an isolated lunatic. He was part of an organized network. He was the destination point for the children and the murderer. Eleanor held up the ornate iron key. Did Jacob ever give you this key or tell you what it opened? Silas's eyes fixed on the key. His terror ratcheted up again. That's the key to the cellar, he breathed. The house has a cellar, Thorne demanded. No, not the house, the shed, the outbuilding next to the house. It's built on a rock foundation. Jacob always kept it locked. Said it was the only place the earth couldn't touch. Said he kept his true prize there. Eleanor felt a sickening wave of comprehension. Jacob Crane hadn't kept all his secrets buried beneath the floor. The bones, the digging, the mother, that was the horror. The prize, the key to his entire operation, was locked away in the shed. He used the house as a graveyard, but the shed was his vault, Eleanor concluded grimly. Thorne stood up. The marshal can handle the grave. We need to secure that shed before Crane or his partners get to it. They had the final clue, the key to the entire mystery, but Jacob Crane was still loose, desperate, and potentially heading back for his prize. The terror is escalating. The sisters now hold the key to a network of cruelty stretching far beyond Presidio. Will they uncover the full truth before Jacob Crane returns? Make sure you've subscribed and hit that notification bell, because the next chapters will reveal the prize and the terrifying identity of the mother. The return to the burned-out property was eerie. The Holloway house was now a smoldering ruin, the smoke a thin column against the relentless Texas sky. The parlor floor was an open, smoking pit, revealing the horrifying dirt-walled cavity beneath. Eleanor, Lillian, and Thorne ignored the ruin and headed straight for the small, heavy-timbered shed 50 yards away. The shed was surprisingly robust, built on a solid stone foundation, just as Silas Crane had described. A heavy iron-bound door with a massive, old-fashioned padlock secured it. Eleanor's hands trembled as she inserted Jacob Crane's ornate iron key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, rusty clunk. Thorne took up a defensive position, weapon ready, as Eleanor pulled the door open. The air inside the shed was cold, still, and dry. It smelled of canvas, leather, and chemicals. The shed was not a storage room for tools. It was a crude, organized workshop. A heavy wooden workbench dominated the center. On it were tools, soldering irons, small chisels, vials of pigments, and rolls of thin, expensive linen and silk. This was a place of delicate, focused labor. Lillian gasped, pointing to the wall. Hanging neatly on pegs were several freshly finished items, exquisite, realistic dolls about 2 feet tall. They were masterpieces of craftsmanship, with delicate porcelain faces, hand-stitched leather shoes, and intricate clothing. He wasn't a murderer, Elle, Lillian whispered, her voice thick with disgust. He was a doll maker. But the horror was only beginning. Thorne walked over to a heavy wooden cupboard in the corner and yanked it open. It was filled with row after row of small, porcelain doll heads. They were perfectly formed, but each one bore a subtly different expression. Some smiling, some vacant, some frozen in a silent, stylized scream. Eleanor approached the workbench. Next to the tools, tucked under a loose floorboard, she found a second, smaller ledger. This one was far cleaner and more meticulously organized than the first. It wasn't a journal of madness. It was a business ledger. It contained a detailed list of transactions, dates, and amounts. The recipients of the dolls were wealthy families in cities like San Francisco, New Orleans, and New York. The dolls fetched astronomical prices. And then Eleanor found the final devastating column of entries. Models. Beside each doll name was a date and a description. Doll, Little Martha, sold $400. Model, young girl, 7 years, dark hair, mole on left cheek, disposed, $412.83. Doll, young George, sold, $350. Model, young boy, 5 years, blonde, missing front tooth, disposed, $72.83. The realization was a punch to the gut. Jacob Crane wasn't just killing children. He was recreating their faces and likenesses in porcelain before he buried them, making his crimes a twisted form of sustained, profitable art. The children were his models, and the murder was part of the process, a permanent way to capture their youthful perfection before the doll was sold. "The boots," Lillian whispered, trembling, "the boots under the floor. They were the children who came before." "The money," Thorne added grimly. "The money wasn't from a trafficking ring. It was his payment for the dolls. Jacob Crane was a predator and an artist. The prize was the financial network, the clientele, and the tools of his trade. Crane's madness was rooted in a perverse form of artistic obsession, a desire to capture perfect, permanent, tragic beauty. But the most terrifying discovery was still to come. Eleanor moved to the far end of the shed where a large industrial metal chest stood, secured with a heavy chain. "This is it," Thorne stated, "his true prize." They forced the chain with the wrecking bar. The chest opened with a rusty shriek. Inside, there was no more money or porcelain. There were 2 items, a large framed photograph and a thick, canvas-bound book. The photograph showed a woman who looked strikingly like Lillian, only older, with a severe, possessive expression. She was holding a beautiful blonde-haired girl in a white dress, a child model. But the woman's eyes were cold, almost predatory. The inscription on the back was simple: Martha and the model. Martha was Jacob Crane's wife, who Silas claimed had fled with the children. The canvas-bound book was a collection of notes, drawings, and formulas. It was Crane's Book of Mothers, a detailed account of his method. Eleanor read the final page aloud. "The perfection of the porcelain is the key. It needs the heat of the body, the moisture of the earth, and the sacrificial blood to bind the pigment. The last step, the final layer, must be mixed with the essence of the model. And for the final doll, the mother doll, it must be the essence of the one who fed the earth." He wasn't a lunatic rambling about the earth. He was describing a horrific process of using the victim's physical elements in his art. As Eleanor absorbed the horror, Thorne suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed to the dusty ground outside the shed door. "Look." There were fresh, deep boot prints in the fine dust. They were not the boots of Thorne, Eleanor, or Lillian. They were a man's large, rough boot prints, clearly made since their arrival. Jacob Crane had been there. He had watched them open the shed. He had seen them discover his terrible prize. And now he knew they had the ledger, the list of his clientele, and the secret of his art. He was not only running, he was stalking them. The revelation that Jacob Crane was stalking them sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. They quickly sealed the shed, knowing that if Crane returned, he would destroy every piece of evidence to protect his clients and his secret. Thorne, now more desperate, sent Lillian back to Presidio to telegraph an urgent message to the marshal, detailing Crane's movements and the shed's contents. Eleanor stayed with Thorne to track Crane's boot prints. The tracks led away from the house and directly toward the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the road, about a mile away. "He's heading for the freight line," Thorne surmised, reloading his rifle. "He's going to try and catch a train out of Presidio." Eleanor, armed with the knowledge of the ledger, realized the significance of the train. "He's not just running, Sheriff. He's going to El Paso. That's where he received the shipments, the children. His partner, the one who acquired the models, must be there." They followed the tracks through the harsh scrubland. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that turned every clump of mesquite into a lurking figure. Suddenly, the prince stopped abruptly near a cluster of large, sun-bleached rocks. Thorn and Eleanor approached cautiously. Behind the rocks, they found the source of the interruption, a small recent campfire, the coals still warm. Crane had stopped to rest and prepare. And next to the fire, there was a crude, bloody bandage made from torn cloth, showing he had dressed the bullet wound Thorn had inflicted. But the final object was the most chilling, a single folded piece of paper, weighted down by a small stone. Eleanor picked it up. It was a hand-drawn map. It was simple, showing the rail line with a large X marked on a location 50 miles down the track, a derelict, isolated railroad shack. And next to the X, a name was scrawled, M. A meeting point, Thorn said, his voice grim. He's meeting his accomplice, M. That could be Martha, his wife, or someone else. Eleanor considered the clues. Martha was in the photo, the wife who apparently fled. Crane's final entry spoke of mother and the Earth's hunger. I think M stands for the partner in El Paso, Sheriff, Eleanor said. The one who supplied the children for his work. He's going to meet them for money or to get help to disappear. They knew they couldn't wait for the marshal. If Crane met his accomplice, all evidence and the chance of capturing his network would be lost. Thorn made his final decision. We're going to commandeer a train. Presidio has a small maintenance depot. We can get a rail hand to take us to that shack. They rode back to Presidio, their horses running flat out. Lillian was waiting, terrified, but having successfully telegraphed the marshal. She was sent to the depot to get the section foreman, a man named Joe, to ready a small engine for the pursuit. Within the hour, they were on a rickety maintenance engine, the small machine rattling and shaking as it picked up speed across the open desert. The three of them, a wounded sheriff, a determined Eleanor, and a terrified but resolute Lillian, were now conducting their own private police operation into the heart of a vast criminal enterprise. As the train rattled past the dark, silent landscape, Eleanor pulled out the second ledger, the business one, and checked the clientele list again. She was looking for anyone who lived in El Paso, the city of the network. She found one, Mrs. Mava Thornton, a wealthy, reclusive widow known for her exquisite taste in art. The name was listed next to one of Crane's most expensive dolls, and her name began with M. Sheriff, Eleanor said, pointing to the name. This is a long shot, but what if M isn't his accomplice, but his biggest customer? What if he's going to her for protection? She's the last person who would want the source of her prized doll revealed. Thorn gripped the throttle. If she's protecting him, she's as guilty as he is. Either way, we're going to that shack. It's the only trail we have. As the train screamed through the night, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, the isolated shack marked on the map. They slowed the engine 50 yards away, cutting the steam to approach in silence. The shack was small and dark. A faint low light glowed in a single window, and the sound of two voices, muffled but distinct, drifted on the wind. Jacob Crane had arrived. Thorn pulled his rifle. Eleanor, you cover the back window. Lillian, you stay on the train. I'll go in the front. We take him alive if we can. As Eleanor crept around the back of the shack, she saw the shadow of a second figure inside. A smaller, shorter shadow. Not a man. She reached the window and pressed her face against the grimy pane. The scene inside was terrifyingly domestic. Jacob Crane was sitting on a crate, his injured legs stretched out, talking to the other figure. It was Martha Crane, his wife, the woman from the photograph. She hadn't fled. She was his accomplice and his partner, the source of the mother fixation in the ledger. She was not alone. She held a small, heavy box in her lap, the true prize Jacob was protecting. And as Eleanor watched, Martha opened the box, revealing a selection of new, perfect porcelain doll heads, ready for painting and binding. The marshal is coming, Jake, Martha said, her voice sharp and cold. They know about the children. They know about the dirt. They don't know about this, Martha, Jacob whispered, pointing to the box of heads. They don't know about the mother doll. We finish it, Martha. We sell it, and we disappear forever. Suddenly, the front door of the shack burst open as Sheriff Thorne charged in, rifle raised. "Freeze! Jacob Crane, you are under arrest!" The confrontation in the shack was swift and violent. As Thorne burst through the front door, Jacob Crane, despite his injured leg, lunged for a heavy wrench he had stashed under his crate. He was clearly expecting this, ready for a final, desperate fight. "You won't take me," Jacob shrieked, swinging the wrench wildly. "The mother protects her own." Thorne ducked the first blow and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The noise was deafening in the cramped space. Eleanor at the window saw Martha Crane, cold and calculating, use the distraction. She didn't move to help her husband. Instead, she grabbed a small vial from her pouch and smashed it onto the iron stove in the corner. A cloud of thick, acrid narcotic smoke instantly filled the air. "The pigment solvent," Eleanor realized, coughing. "It's designed to stun." Thorne was immediately overcome, his movements slowing. Jacob took advantage, slamming the wrench into Thorne's chest. The sheriff collapsed with a painful gasp, his rifle sliding across the floor. Eleanor smashed the window with her poker and scrambled through. "Lillian, get help!" she screamed, knowing her sister was still on the train. Inside, the noxious fumes burned her eyes and throat, but Eleanor pushed through the pain. Jacob, now standing over the fallen sheriff, turned his attention to Eleanor, his eyes wild. "You, the one who opened the earth," he snarled, dropping the wrench and grabbing the final item from the crate, a magnificent, intricately crafted, finished doll. It was the mother doll, taller than the others, with the cold, severe eyes of Martha Crane in porcelain. "This is the last piece," Jacob screamed, holding the doll like a shield. "The masterpiece. We used the essence of the 12 to create her." "It's over, Jacob," Eleanor choked out, struggling to stand. "The ledger is safe. The marshal is coming. Your customers know. You failed." Martha Crane, meanwhile, was scooping up the remaining porcelain heads from the box, preparing to flee out the back. "No, we haven't," Martha yelled, turning back. "The earth has a tongue, girl, and it's speaking to them now." Martha pointed to a large, dusty trunk in the corner. It was heavily padlocked. "The last body, Jacob. The last one. The only one who can talk." Martha screamed at her husband. Eleanor's mind raced. The mother in the ledger wasn't just a fixation. It was the mother of the final child they buried. The one who could identify them. Jacob hesitated, his eyes darting between Eleanor, the doll, and the trunk. His artistic obsession finally broke through his madness. He couldn't risk the doll. "The earth can have her," he screamed, making a final desperate grab for his wife. "We leave now." Martha resisted, trying to hold on to the last of the porcelain heads. As they wrestled, Thorne, barely conscious, managed to retrieve his rifle and fire a final desperate shot. The bullet struck the wooden crate near Jacob's head, splitting the timber. But the impact caused Jacob to lurch violently. He fell against the stove, sending a stack of oil-soaked rags onto the open flame. The shack instantly erupted into a fresh, blazing inferno. Martha, seeing the fire, abandoned her husband and the box of heads, scrambling out the back door into the darkness. Jacob, however, was trapped by the flames, paralyzed by the sight of the burning rags. Eleanor, coughing violently, grabbed the trunk key from Jacob's pouch, which had fallen nearby, and dragged the stunned Sheriff Thorne out of the shack's front door, just as the roof began to collapse. They collapsed 20 yards away, watching the railroad shack become a pyre, consuming Jacob Crane and the last of his terrifying creations. Lillian, having witnessed the explosion from the train, rushed to them, tears streaming down her face. The federal marshal arrived the next morning. The ledger and the photograph of Martha were enough to confirm the horrific story. The remains of Jacob Crane were recovered, along with the partially melted porcelain heads. More crucially, the trunk that Eleanor had grabbed was opened. Inside, they found the remains of a small, thin woman, the mother who had tracked her child to the house. She had been captured by the Cranes and imprisoned in the trunk for a time, then murdered and buried beneath the floor. But the Cranes, in their haste, had failed to properly dispose of her final evidence. A locket containing a miniature photograph of her husband and their child, along with a scrap of paper detailing the names of the people who had sold her child, the El Paso suppliers. With the ledger's customer list, the suppliers' names, and Martha Crane's description, the federal marshals launched a massive investigation. Martha Crane was eventually captured trying to cross the border into Mexico. The full network of suppliers and the wealthy clientele who bought the models were systematically exposed, leading to a massive scandal that shook the wealthier cities of the American frontier. Eleanor and Lillian, now hailed as local heroes, never rebuilt the house. They sold the scorched, empty land, donating the funds to a newly established orphanage in Fort Stockton, a monument to the 12 children and the mother who died beneath the floorboards. The Holloway sisters left Presidio, forever marked by the dust and the silence, but with a profound understanding of the darkness that can take root in the heart of man, and the courage it takes to bring the truth to light. The terror was over, but the grim reality of the frontier and the depth of human malice were lessons they would carry forever.